Welcome to Mythos AI, your source for Cliff's Notes on complex subjects. Join Anna and Phil for yet another engaging conversation.
Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to take a deep dive into how different leaders have approached the idea of peace, specifically contrasting Ronald Reagan's peace through strength philosophy with Donald Trump's more transactional approach.
Sounds fascinating.
We'll be referencing this really interesting academic article, Peace Through Strength versus Peace Through Deals, Ronald Reagan and Donald Trump on the meaning of peace.
Oh, I've read that one.
Yeah, it really gets you thinking, doesn't it? So basically, we're trying to figure out if peace is best achieved through strength, like a show of force and clear moral boundaries, or through negotiation, compromise, maybe even making deals.
It's a question that's been debated for centuries, and this article gives us some great insights into both sides of the argument.
Exactly. Okay, so let's start with Ronald Reagan. The guy's a bit of an icon, right? I mean, his whole perspective on peace was really shaped by the Cold War and, how he saw the Soviet Union. So can you kind of break down why he saw the USSR as such a huge threat?
Well, Reagan was deeply anti-communist, and that stance really goes back to his time in Hollywood. He saw firsthand what he believed was communist infiltration in the film industry and labor unions.
Wow, I didn't know that.
It's not something that's widely talked about, but it definitely had a profound impact on his worldview. That experience solidified his belief that communism was this insidious force that was actively trying to undermine American values, American freedom.
So it wasn't just theoretical for him, it was personal.
Exactly. And on top of that, he saw the Soviet Union's totalitarian system, their whole goal of global communist revolution, as a direct threat to the American way of life. The Soviet military buildup, their expansionist policies, it all added up to a real and present danger in his mind.
Which brings us to his famous peace through strength doctrine. He wasn't just talking about having a big military, right? It was more about a moral imperative, a way of life.
You hit the nail on the head. He believed peace wasn't just about the absence of conflict, but about actively protecting freedom and security. And to do that, you needed strength, vigilance, a willingness to defend those values wherever they were threatened.
And he really did walk the walk. I mean, in his A Time for Choosing speech back in 1964, he said, and I quote, "There can be no real peace while one American is dying someplace in the world for the rest of us."
Powerful words. That quote really captures Reagan's belief that America had a responsibility to be a global guardian of freedom. And it wasn't about being a warmonger. He thought that by projecting strength, by showing that we were ready to stand up for what we believed in, the U.S. could prevent conflicts from even starting. It was a deterrent.
And it's interesting how he used such strong language to convey that message. Like when he said, "We are at war with the most dangerous enemy that has ever faced mankind in his long climb from the swamp to the stars."
He definitely had a flair for the dramatic. But those words weren't just for show. He truly believed the Soviet Union was an existential threat to human progress, to freedom itself. And that's why he was so adamant about not giving an inch.
Yeah, he wasn't one for compromise when it came to the Soviets.
Right, like in his 1983 Evil Empire speech, he was basically saying, don't fall for the trap of thinking both sides are equally to blame. He urged his audience to beware the temptation of pride, the temptation to blithely declare yourselves above it all and label both sides equally at fault, to ignore the facts of history and the aggressive impulses of an evil empire. He was so clear about the dangers of appeasement, he believed it only made totalitarian regimes bolder.
So for him, the Cold War was this stark moral battle between freedom and tyranny. And America had to be on the side of freedom, no question.
Absolutely. That's why he took such a firm stance against the Soviet Union, what he famously called the evil empire. And he believed that this American ideal of individual liberty transcended political parties. He once said, "There is no such thing as left or right, only up or down, up to a man's age-old dream, the ultimate in individual freedom, consistent with law and order, or down to the ant-heap of totalitarianism."
Such a powerful way of putting it. And that conviction really fueled his rejection of appeasement.
Right. He saw it as a slippery slope that would only lead to more conflict in the long run. In his A Time for Choosing speech, he warned against those who preached peace without victory. He said, "Unless we realize that we are in a war that must be won, those who would trade our freedom for the soup kitchen of the welfare state have told us that they have a utopian solution of peace without victory. They call their policy accommodation. And they say if we only avoid any direct confrontation with the enemy, he will forget his evil ways and learn to love us. All who oppose them are indicted as warmongers. They say we offer simple answers to complex problems. Well, perhaps there is a simple answer, not an easy answer, but simple."
He really believed that confronting threats head-on, even if it meant sacrifice, was the only way to ensure peace. He famously said, "The greater risk lies in appeasement." He often pointed to what happened with Hitler in the 1930s, how appeasement only emboldened the Nazis and led to a more devastating war.
It was a lesson he took to heart. Strength and resolve, that was his mantra.
And this brings us to another crucial aspect of Reagan's worldview. His belief in America as this beacon of freedom for those fleeing oppression. In that same "A Time for Choosing" speech, he told a story about a Cuban refugee who said to him, "How lucky you are. I had some place to escape to."
That story is so poignant. It really gets to the heart of how Reagan saw America's role in the world, not just as a powerful nation, but as a sanctuary, a place of hope for those escaping tyranny.
Yeah, America's strength was a force for good in his eyes, a protector of the vulnerable. It's clear that his belief in American exceptionalism was a driving force behind his foreign policy.
Absolutely. It shaped his vision for peace, his commitment to peace through strength.
Okay, so we've talked about the philosophy, but how did that actually play out during his presidency? What concrete actions did he take?
Well, Reagan put his money where his mouth was when it came to peace through strength. He ramped up military spending, modernized the U.S. nuclear arsenal. Remember the Strategic Defense Initiative, what everyone called Star Wars? That was all him.
Oh yeah, that was huge.
He also provided a lot of support to anti-communist movements around the world, most notably in Afghanistan and Nicaragua. All of this was part of his strategy to contain Soviet expansionism and ultimately push for the collapse of the Soviet system. He really believed it was inherently flawed and bound to fail.
Yeah, and I mean, it was controversial at the time. A lot of people criticized him for being too confrontational. But looking back, many people credit his tough stance on the USSR with contributing to its eventual downfall.
Yeah, it's tough to say for sure what single factor brought down the Soviet Union. It was probably a combination of things, internal pressures, a failing economy. But there's no denying that Reagan's policies played a significant role in ending the Cold War.
His legacy is still debated, but his peace through strength philosophy is still hugely influential in discussions about international relations, how we approach security policy, all of that.
And this raises the question of whether a similar approach could be effective in dealing with Russia today.
Could a combination of military support for Ukraine and economic sanctions on Russia lead to the downfall of Putin's regime?
It's a possibility worth considering. The sanctions imposed on Russia since the invasion of Ukraine have already taken a significant toll on its economy.
And there's evidence that the war is becoming increasingly unpopular in Russia, with growing signs of dissent.
If this pressure continues to mount, it could potentially lead to internal instability and a challenge to Putin's grip on power. However, there are also key differences between the Soviet Union and present-day Russia.
For one, Russia has a more diversified economy, less reliant on heavy industry and military production, making it less vulnerable to economic pressure.
And Putin has a much tighter grip on power than Soviet leaders did in the late 1980s. He controls the media, the security services, and the judiciary, making it much more difficult for any opposition to organize or challenge his rule.
So while it's possible that a sustained pressure campaign could weaken Putin's regime, it's by no means a certainty.
And this is where Trump's approach becomes problematic. His reluctance to provide further aid to Ukraine and his wavering stance on NATO send a message of uncertainty to both allies and adversaries.
Exactly. Consistency is key in dealing with someone like Putin. If he senses weakness or a lack of resolve, he'll exploit it.
Trump's transactional approach, his focus on immediate gains rather than long-term strategic goals, undermines the sustained pressure needed to effectively counter Russian aggression. It also raises questions about America's commitment to its allies.
And it weakens the entire Western alliance. If the U.S. is seen as unreliable, its support conditional and subject to change based on political whims.
Absolutely. Reagan understood the importance of strong alliances, particularly NATO. He saw them as essential to deterring aggression and maintaining global stability.
Trump's questioning of NATO's value and his demands for financial contributions undermine that unity and embolden adversaries like Russia and China.
They also send a dangerous message that America's commitments are not to be trusted and that its allies cannot rely on its support in times of need.
So now let's switch gears and talk about Donald Trump and his approach to peace, which is, well, quite different from Reagan's. How would you characterize it?
Well, Trump's America First doctrine really prioritizes economic self-interest, and it tends to shy away from those long-term commitments to allies that Reagan was all about. It's a stark contrast, it's much more transactional. It's about deal-making, achieving immediate concrete results for the United States.
So it's less about ideology and more about, like, pragmatism, getting the best deal.
Precisely. He approaches international relations more like a business negotiation. He's looking for agreements that he believes will benefit American interests, often putting those ahead of other considerations.
And I imagine this difference in worldview really comes into play when we look at how they approach international conflict, right?
Oh, absolutely. And a prime example of that is Trump's handling of the Ukraine-Russia conflict.
Great point. We'll definitely delve into that in the next part of our deep dive.
Trump said many times that he could end the war in Ukraine in 24 hours if he could just sit down and negotiate, which really shows how much he believes in deal-making as a way to solve even these, like, super tough conflicts.
Yeah, it seems like he sees the whole situation in Ukraine very differently from how Reagan saw the Cold War.
Exactly. Reagan viewed the Cold War as this epic struggle between good and evil, freedom versus tyranny. But Trump seems to see conflicts like the one in Ukraine more like regional disputes that can be settled with, some good old-fashioned bargaining.
So he doesn't really see Russia's actions as a threat to America the way Reagan saw the Soviet Union.
Right. It's more like he sees it as a problem to be managed, a deal to be struck. And that really comes across in how he talks about it, too. Reagan was always condemning the Soviet Union, calling them out. But Trump has made some pretty surprising statements about the conflict, even calling Zelensky a dictator.
Wow, that's a pretty strong statement.
Yeah, and it's made a lot of people wonder if he's really grasping the seriousness of the situation, especially since it often praises Putin's leadership in the same breath. It's confusing to America's allies and might even embolden Russia.
And this transactional approach, it even extends to how he views refugees. Trump said he plans to revoke the protected status for Ukrainian refugees, which would basically force them to go back to a war zone. That's a far cry from how Reagan welcomed refugees fleeing communism.
That's a really important point. It shows a fundamental difference in their worldviews. Reagan saw America as a safe haven for people escaping oppression, but Trump seems more concerned with national security and the potential economic burden of refugees.
And their views on NATO also highlight this contrast. Reagan was such a strong supporter of NATO, he saw it as essential for keeping the peace in Europe, a symbol of America's commitment to its allies.
Absolutely. He saw it as a vital alliance against Soviet expansionism.
But Trump has been quite skeptical of NATO. He's questioned whether it's still relevant today and suggested that other countries aren't pulling their weight financially.
He's really hammered on the fact that some NATO members aren't spending enough on defense, even threatened to pull the U.S. out if they don't meet their targets. And that's caused a lot of anxiety among European allies who rely on NATO for their security. They're worried that Trump's stance could make Russia more aggressive.
Yeah, it's pretty clear that they have very different ideas about the role of alliances. Reagan saw them as crucial for collective security, for promoting shared values, but Trump seems to view them more as business deals where America needs to get something tangible in return.
Which brings us back to that big question we started with. What's the best way to achieve peace? Through strength and moral clarity, like Reagan believed, or through negotiation and compromise, like Trump's approach?
It's such a complex issue, and looking at how these two presidents approached it, it's clear that both approaches have their potential benefits and risks.
Reagan's supporters often point to the collapse of the Soviet Union as proof that peace through strength works. They argue that his military buildup, the economic pressure he put on the USSR, and his backing of anti-communist movements all helped weaken the Soviet system and ultimately lead to its demise.
But people who favor a less confrontational approach might say that the Soviet Union fell apart more because of its own internal problems, like a weak economy, and not just because of Reagan's policies.
Right. They might argue that his hardline stance just made things more tense and dragged out the Cold War, leading to a really dangerous and expensive arms race.
It's a complicated historical debate for sure, and there probably isn't one definitive answer. But it's important to think about the downsides of both approaches. Like, Reagan's critics say he risked escalating conflicts, and some argue that Trump's focus on deal-making could embolden aggressors and weaken alliances.
Exactly. Trump's skepticism of NATO and his willingness to work with authoritarian leaders like Putin has some people worried that he's actually undermining the very institutions that have helped keep the world stable for decades. They argue that his America First approach creates a leadership vacuum and allows countries like Russia and China to become more aggressive in pursuing their own agendas.
And it's interesting how economic troubles have played a role in both the Soviet Union and Russia's foreign policy. The Soviet Union basically crumbled under the weight of its own economic problems.
And now, with the war in Ukraine and the West imposing all these sanctions, Russia's economy is under immense pressure. Some believe that these economic factors could be more effective than military action in getting Putin to change course and making peace possible.
That's a good reminder that there's more to international relations than just military might. Economic leverage, the ability to withstand economic pain, those things can be really powerful tools too.
For sure. The situation with Russia shows us how economic strategies can be used to try to achieve foreign policy goals. It shows that strength comes in different forms, and that a successful foreign policy has to take into account the complex interplay of economics, military power, and diplomacy.
So comparing Reagan and Trump, it's obvious that there isn't one simple solution for achieving peace. What works in one situation might not work in another.
And what worked in the past might not be the answer today, especially with all the new global challenges and threats we're facing.
It really highlights the need for flexible strategies and for really understanding the nuances of international relations. Maybe the takeaway here is that it's not a simple choice between strength and diplomacy, between confrontation and cooperation.
Yeah, maybe the most effective approach is finding the right balance between those elements, a balance that can adapt to the specific circumstances.
And this brings us to a really interesting point that the article makes about the different worldviews represented by Reagan's A Time for Choosing speech and Trump's America First doctrine. They really represent two different ways of thinking about America's role in the world.
One emphasizes global leadership and standing up for freedom and democracy, while the other focuses on national self-interest and a more isolationist stance.
It's amazing how those different worldviews shape their ideas about how to achieve peace. Like Reagan's A Time for Choosing speech, it really laid out his vision for America. He saw the U.S. as this champion of freedom on the world stage, fighting against the spread of communism.
He felt strongly that America had a moral duty to lead that fight, that strength, military, and in terms of ideas, was key to stopping aggression and protecting liberty. He saw the world in black and white, good versus evil, and America had to stand with the good guys, even if it meant standing alone.
And then you have Trump's America First, which is all about putting American interests first, focusing on the economy, and taking a more practical approach to foreign policy.
Yeah, he sees international relations as a series of deals, trying to get the best possible outcome for the U.S., and sometimes that means setting aside moral questions or long-term alliances.
So they make very different choices because of that. Reagan, with his focus on American exceptionalism and fighting communism, boosted military spending, got involved in proxy wars, and tried to weaken the Soviet Union.
And Trump, all about economic nationalism and deal-making, pulled the U.S. out of agreements like the Iran nuclear deal and the Paris Climate Accord, put tariffs on other countries, and tried to renegotiate things with longtime allies.
This article we're looking at, it doesn't say one way is right or wrong, but it makes us think about what each worldview means for lasting peace. Can you get peace just through strength and moral clarity, like Reagan believed? Or do you need a more practical, deal-making approach like Trump's?
That's the million-dollar question, especially in the world today, which is so complicated and interconnected. We've got globalization, nuclear weapons everywhere, new technologies popping up all the time. It's a whole different ballgame when it comes to peace.
It's like, what worked for Reagan during the Cold War, that might not be the answer now.
Exactly. And while Trump's deal-making might work in the short term, who knows if that's enough to tackle these huge global problems that need countries to work together and commit for the long haul.
The article ends by asking, can you really achieve peace through deals alone? Or do you need to be committed to values, defending freedom and standing up to tyranny, even when it's tough?
It's a question that makes us consider the moral side of foreign policy, how values influence international relations. It suggests that maybe lasting peace needs more than just strategy and economic interests. Maybe it needs a dedication to principles, a willingness to fight for them, even if there's a price to pay.
This deep dive into how we think about peace has given us a lot to think about. It's a reminder that there are no easy answers in international relations, and that to achieve peace, we need to understand history, be aware of what's happening right now, and carefully consider the consequences of our actions. Thanks for listening, everyone.
Thanks for listening to Mythos AI. Stay tuned for more concise insights. And remember to hit the like button and subscribe for future episodes.